My dear friends, my name is Horácio Bernardes Neto. I'm a Brazilian lawyer practicing in São Paulo, Brazil, and I happen to be presently the president of the International Bar Association. The IBA is very proud to co-sponsor this event. You know that our prime objective is to protect and to promote the rule of law. And we don't only have it as our prime objective because we are lawyers, we are committed to the rule of law, we are committed to ethical principles, we are committed to doing what is legal. But it's not only that. We also protect and promote the rule of law because of selfishness. Without the rule of law, there wouldn't be lawyers. And legal fees is the only word that I know that make lawyers laugh. When I take pictures with lawyers, I say, legal fees! And everybody laughs. So that it is really very important for us lawyers to protect, to defend, to promote the rule of law. And the IBA has been doing that for the last 71 years. And we hope that we will have another 710 years to go on and protect and give small steps in the direction of the rule of law. But nowadays, in the present days, we are not that happy. We cannot be very happy. There are threats to the rule of law happening all over the world, in places we would never imagine that they would happen. My country, Brazil, your country, the United States, Poland, Hungary, Singapore, China, and huge list of countries, Venezuela, in which the rule of law is being threatened together with our core prerogatives. So we lawyers will have to be very strong right now in order to defend and to promote and to speak for the rule of law. It's very interesting because even in the legal profession, there are few people that really understand what the rule of law is. And I did this survey myself by asking international lawyers all over the world, what do you think the rule of law is? And they say, well, rule of law is living according with the law. And I say, no, it isn't. Hitler, during the Hitler time in Germany, there were all those laws, and everybody lived according to those laws. But none of us will say that they were living under the rule of law. The rule of law is a very complicated concept. Sometimes it's so complicated to define the rule of law that it seems that there is no definition, that there is no way to define the rule of law. So that we lawyers must understand what the rule of law means. We must teach lay people and civil society what the rule of law means, and especially we must teach, we must educate our partners, our bars, our colleagues, our families, that rule of law is a very broad concept. I say to my children that every time you go to the movies and you could cut the line, you are threatening the rule of law. So that let's try to spread this very important concept of the rule of law. And that's what Homer And I take this opportunity to greet you, my dear friend Homer Moyer. And Sarah, thank you very much for having us here. I thank every one of you for being here. The IEA, in this attempt of promoting and provoking people to understand what the rule of law means, has produced 8 short films. Those films are in our web page. They are completely free of any kind of copyright or anything, so you can go to the web page, you can show them to whoever you want, to show it to your colleagues, to your bars, to your firms, to everybody. They are there. And I'm going to show you one of them, which is the one I maybe like the most. The 8 of them are very, very interesting, but this one is maybe the one I like the most because it really demonstrates what I have said 1 minute ago. The rule of law is a complicated concept. The motto of this campaign the IBA is doing to promote the rule of law is take care of the rule of law, and the rule of law will take care of you. Thank you very much.
Bernardo, thank you very much.
Things like judges that are independent, freedom of the press, and officials who can't be corrupted are just some of the essential elements of what's known as the rule of law. They are the building blocks that support our freedoms. But take one of these elements away, and the rule of law is in danger of collapsing, and our freedoms along with it. So, beware of any attempts to erode the rule of law, because if you look after the rule of law, it will look after you.
Society at all levels has a need to work together to solve the many challenges facing our state and our nation. I know that it's possible for people to sit down together and engage in cooperative problem solving. And we'd like to create an atmosphere again where there's room for civil debate and consensus building. My hope is to recreate a place that will be a center for problem solving and for bringing together groups with divergent views. This is what I want the O'Connor Institute to stand for. We can do it. The possibilities are endless.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Rule of Law Town Hall, a nonpartisan discussion of the rule of law, what that term means, what its implications are, and its relevance to all of us. My name is Homer Moyer. It's my privilege to moderate this evening's discussion. And on behalf of the International Bar Association and the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute, to welcome you to this evening's event and to this beautiful venue which Arizona State University has graciously made available to us. We are joined by 4 distinguished guests this evening, all of whom have ties to Arizona and to Phoenix and who are familiar to you. Their impressive backgrounds are in your programs, but let me briefly introduce each before we get underway. To my immediate left is Ruth McGregor, retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama. Arizona. I think we can edit these films just a bit. Also from Arizona, Senator Jon Kyl, who's represented the state both in the House of Representatives and the Senate over a course of 19 years. Next is Nicole Carroll, a journalist who for many years was here with the Arizona Republic and is today the editor-in-chief of USA Today. And at the far end, Professor Emeritus Miles Link, who is a professor here at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. I should note a small error in the program which says that the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, of which Miles is a part, reports to the District of Columbia Bar. In fact, it reports to the District of Columbia Court. We wanted to make that clear to avoid any possible conflict of interest. And let me add as a personal note, having had the privilege of working with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor for nearly 20 years on rule of law issues, I'm delighted that our first Rule of Law Town Hall is here in Phoenix, as it should be. The term rule of law is defined a number of different ways, has been defined many ways. In your programs and on the screen are what we've identified as core principles of the rule of law. Although the definitions vary, these principles appear in almost every definition of that term. And so I'd like to begin there and start with basics. And Miles Link, turn to you. All of these principles are embedded in our Constitution. It's part of the supreme law of the land. And I'd like for you just to remind us what it was that caused our founding fathers to think these principles were so important to be part of our national charter.
Homer, thank you. We need to remember what the founders had gone through before they drafted the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention and then later adopted the Bill of Rights. First, they'd fought a Revolutionary War, a war that was unprecedented at the time, against a distant monarch who had absolute power, and they were not represented in that government. In fact, that was one of the reasons they fought that war. Second, they'd gone through the Articles of Confederation government, which we often forget, but which was the first attempt at a central government to unite the 13 new states. And it didn't work. It was ineffective, it was weak, and it was clear it had to be replaced. And so what the founders wanted was a central government that was effective and strong enough to unite those 13 very, very disparate states. In fact, in Europe, they didn't think the republic would ever work. The only model there was of a republic at that time was small Switzerland. And here they were going to basically try to unite almost a continent of states. And the second thing they wanted was to ensure public participation in the government. And the document they crafted, the Constitution, made it clear that the power derived from the people, not from the government. And the Constitution gave to the government carefully delineated, express authority in limited areas. And so Article 1 dealt with the legislature, Article 2 with the executive branch, Article 3 with the judicial branch. They also wanted to control against regional bias. So we have diversity of citizenship jurisdiction in the federal courts where judges can, federal judges can accept claims from parties from different states. So they're not, the parties aren't biased by having to bring their claim in a different state. They wanted to ensure public participation. All of the representatives are elected, the congressmen and the senators and the executive are elected. At the same time, they wanted to ensure that the judges would be free from undue influence, so the judges are appointed, but they have lifetime tenure, so they don't have to worry about what's the tenure for their jobs. And so these were the kinds of things the drafters considered, faced, and sought to implement to create a democracy and a country that was united by this fundamental legal document, the Constitution, which addressed some of the evils they had seen come before.
For judges, these principles set ground rules for everything that courts do. In dealing with cases that come before courts, how do judges tend to think about these basic principles?
Yeah, you're right, Dad. principles of the rule of law are both the basis of and reason for a justice system. So when cases come to the court, although judges may not always directly refer to the principles of the rule of law, those principles underlie everything the courts do. It might be, even in a civil case, a simple contract dispute. The principle of law that requires our law to be predictable and people to be able to rely upon and feel secure in the law would be important in that case. Other cases would involve other principles. There might be a case in which somebody challenged the actions of the legislative or executive branch of government as going beyond the power of that branch of government. And that would call into question the principle, it isn't working.
Okay, you all heard me well enough. I don't have to start from the beginning. All right, so other cases might be more complex and might involve actually whether or not the court needs to limit the exercise of power because another branch of government acted beyond the scope of those carefully delineated powers within the Constitution. So, and in each case, the court, I hope, would be very aware of the fact that judges must be impartial and independent, that judges must give justice to the persons and parties appearing before them so that everybody has the same status before a court. And this we'll talk about, I think, a little more later, but the impartiality of judges and the fact that people can rely upon them to have a fair resolution of their case is central to our justice system and to adhering to the rule of law.
Thank you. Nicole Carroll, freedom of the press is something that is expressly mentioned in our Constitution, expressly protected by our Constitution. Perhaps as a result, it's one reason we have not had government-controlled media in our country. But remind us, if you would, some of the ways that freedom of the press and responsible journalism relate to the rule of law.
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical to the rule of law. If you think about the rule of law as widely known and equally enforced and independently adjudicated, the press has a role in all of those. When laws are being considered, we write about them, we examine them. When they're being enforced, we look for equality, we point it out when it's not there, and we hold accountable those who would flout the law and look into to make sure there's an independent judiciary. I love that you took us back to the time of the founders because it relates to the freedom of the press as well. If you think about the colonists under English rule, it was a crime to criticize the government even if it was true. There was a saying, the greater the truth, the greater the libel. So our founders knew that even though they didn't always like the press, that it was a critical check on government. And we provide that critical check every day to current day. In fact, there was a recent study that said when a city loses its independent press, the cost of government actually go up.
Senator Kyle, these principles are obviously important to preserving liberty and freedoms, but many point out that they are also important to our economic well-being, to business and commerce. What's your view on that, sir?
Indeed, in fact, I would say they are essential to the well-functioning of a commercial system. As important as the rule of law is to the functioning of our political system, can you imagine being able to engage in any kind of commercial activity without the trust of the system that exists? You know that if you provide money to someone in exchange for a good, that you will be guaranteed that you'll receive that good. If you buy a home from someone, there will be a piece of paper recorded that says you own it, and that piece of paper will be protected by the system that's been created as well as the physical protection of the piece of paper. So it's based upon trust. It's also based upon certainty. And in those situations in commerce where a conflict does arise, it is importantly also based upon the knowledge that there will be a fair dispute resolution mechanism, whether in court or in some other way, that any commercial conflict will be resolved fairly. So you have the certainty that when you engage in Congress, when you put your money down, that you're going to get what you paid for, that it'll be protected in the event of a problem, that there is a fair way to resolve that. This was deemed so important that following World War II, the United States really took the lead in trying to create an international regime of rule of law for commercial transactions through the international banking system, through the World Trade Organization, and through some other commercial regulatory regimes to ensure that worldwide we could have a commercial system, a trading system that would enjoy protection through the rule of law. And by and large, I think one would agree that that system has been largely responsible for the way the world has flourished since the end of World War II.
Perhaps the central principle of the rule of law is that the powers of the government itself are limited. As we all know, our government's organized in 3 different branches. Each is given certain specified powers and limited to those, and we have a system of checks and balances by which each branch of the government has checks and balances against the other 2. And the idea that the government itself and government officials are themselves bound by the rule of law is a central notion for our system of government. That's not a universal model, not a universally followed model. So Miles Link, how important is this principle of limited government and accountability to our society?
I think it's essential. I think it goes back to a fundamental principle in our society.
Is that light on? Press that again. Okay.
Hello, hello? I think it's essential. I think it goes back to a fundamental principle in our society that power derives from the people, and the people have given certain limited powers to the government in order for the government to effectively regulate the economy, effectively regulate other aspects of society. One of the most interesting challenges in a democracy like ours is the challenge between liberty and equality of opportunity. You know, on the Supreme Court, it says equal justice under law. Well, in order to ensure equal justice under law, you need honest judges, competent judges, you need lawyers to interpret the law and apply it. And equal justice under law means we have a society that is regulated in order to ensure equality of opportunity and equality of how the law affects different people. On the other hand, one of the essential elements of our democracy is liberty, is that people are free to express themselves freely, and that people are free to engage in economic and other activities to the fullest extent possible. And one of the ways in which a democracy and a society effectively operates under the rule of law is how well it balances those two sometimes disparate challenges in order to achieve a stable, prosperous, and effective society.
Justice McGregor, Alexander Hamilton called the judicial branch the weakest branch of government. Yet it's the courts that are called upon from time to time to determine whether any branch of government has overstepped its bounds, as you mentioned. When you have a case that raises that kind of an issue, holding the government's own feet to the fire, how do you think about that? How do judges think about those kinds of issues?
Well, those cases and they come to both state and federal courts, are both the most difficult and yet the most essential for a court to resolve. They're the most difficult because they do deal with co-equal branches of government. And the courts try to be attentive to the powers and responsibilities of the political branches, as the courts hope those branches are attentive to the powers and responsibilities of the judicial branch. But if one branch of government improperly exercises powers that are entrusted to another, where does that branch of government go to get relief? If a president, through an executive order, takes on powers that are reserved to Congress, how do we get relief from that action? And the answer is that only the courts can provide that relief. It's a fragile balance that we maintain in our form of democracy, and it requires the courts, as kind of the deciding body to determine whether one branch has overstepped its powers. I'll give you an example of when that happened. Going back to the 1950s, we were in the Korean War. And President Truman was very concerned about the possibility that the steel workers would strike and that the production of steel would be limited. He didn't want to go through the Taft-Hartley Act, under which Congress had established particular procedures to be followed to gain an injunction. So relying upon his authority as Commander-in-Chief, he issued an executive order forbidding the strike. The case made its way up and eventually to the Supreme Court, which held that the President had no basis for this power and he had no authorization from Congress that he needed to take this action. So, as always happens in those cases, the decision was left to the court, but the court relied upon the governing documents, the constitutional grant of powers, and related legislation to determine whether the President had overstepped his powers.
Senator Kyle, you've seen checks and balances firsthand. How's it feel to be checked or balanced?
Well, it all depended, but by the way, an important footnote to what Justice McGregor said, and the President abided by the court's ruling. And that's a critical component of the checks and balances and underlies a fundamental principle of our government. Namely, you're going to win sometimes, you're going to lose sometimes. When you lose, you abide by the result of the election or by the result of the decision or by the result of the compromise in legislation, whatever it might have been. And I think that's important for citizens today to remind themselves. It's not so bad to be checked or balanced. I would say that the thing that concerns me about the checks and balances today is that our system is never exactly in balance. Throughout the history, the executive has sometimes been more powerful than the legislative branch, and vice versa. The court has, I don't think, ever been the most powerful, but sometimes it's had its authority challenged. But more often than not, its decisions have been accepted. I think that the founders were very prescient about the way the two branches of policymaking could check each other, but they didn't get it exactly right. And as time has gone on, we've seen that imbalances can occur. For example, they thought that impeachment would be a sort of first-order check on executive branch personnel, on judges, on the President himself. It turns out impeachment is really hard. And so it may not be quite the remedy that the founders thought. And I've debated this subject with others. It seems to me that today the legislative branch has ceded too much authority to the President, and presidents have been all too happy to gather up that authority. And even in matters beyond military or foreign affairs, the executive has become, in our society, in our culture, a more important element of government than I think the founders intended and that I believe is warranted. So I'm for Congress taking back a little bit of its authority.
So let me ask you this on that point. And the question is how these checks and balances coexist with politics. Every member of Congress takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, but it has oversight responsibilities. Suppose the executive branch oversteps an executive agency in some fashion, but the executive branch is controlled by the same party to which the member of Congress belongs. How should a member of Congress sort that out? The obligation for checks and balances and his party loyalty or loyalty to constituents?
Well, one can talk about how it should be done. I'll tell you how it is done. And it's not surprising that if the President is of your party, the tendency is to support the President, not to attack him. And on the other side, the tendency is to go after him. And that's based upon party politics and probably to some extent on pragmatic philosophical grounds. What one should do, of course, is to look at it in a larger constitutional context. And if you're in the legislative branch, for example, and there's an accusation the president has overstepped his authority, you'd ought to be willing to take the action necessary to correct that action. Politically, it's really hard to do if you're in the same party, but it's not impossible. You saw leaders of the state of Arizona involved, John Rhodes and Barry Goldwater, involved in taking the message to the President of the United States, that is, I'm talking about Richard Nixon now, that his days were numbered. And this was not an easy thing for them to do, but they were willing to take on the president of their party in order to relieve the system of a big problem that President Nixon had created. So it can be done. People do rise to the authority, and I'll just add one final thing. There are long-serving members of the Senate, for example, some of whom talk about and have recognized the importance of certain traditions and ways that the Senate operates as being critical over the long term to the proper functioning of the legislative branch and to our government as a whole. And they have to, on occasion, remind younger members who don't like the way things are going at the moment that there are reasons why these principles and traditions exist, and that one should think very carefully before one wants to overturn them. And that's hard to do in the heat of the moment politically, but our system of government is set up, as Professor Link said, in a pretty elegant way with the long term in mind. And if you bear that in mind, you may be better guided in the kinds of decisions you make when it involves the pitting of your branch of government versus another.
Nicole Carroll, we are a self-governed nation. Do we need to remind ourselves from time to time that all of us, the voting public, we're the ultimate check and balance in our system of government?
We absolutely are. The people are the ultimate checks and balances, and it's the journalist's job to make sure that those people are informed. And it's why we spend so much time covering elections and candidates. It's why we were talking right before this session about why the Arizona Republic has invested so much in covering water. It's an incredibly complicated and serious topic for Arizona. The expertise we've developed to help cover that for the state is important. You know, Twitter is not going to do that for us. It's the independent press that's going to take on these issues for the informed electorate. The other example, just from Arizona, is on the border wall and border security, obviously really important to the country. When we did a series of articles on that, we wanted to really put the power in the hands of the people. So we rented a helicopter, and if you guys remember, we flew journalists from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, and we filmed every part of the border so that they could go and search and see for themselves. Don't take our word for it. Go, and we gave them original material. That's the value of journalism, to help people be that ultimate checks and balance.
Miles.
One of the here we go. One of the ways in which we achieve the goal Nicole was talking about, I sometimes think it's very effective to think, and I think Senator Kyle alluded to this, when one party wins, for example, and you participate in an election and you lose, through consent in our society, the loser understands that the winner will govern. It's not the person I voted for, but they will govern, and that's consent. And we do that because we have a sense of community. We have a sense that the larger community, which includes us but not just us, we are a part of, and we value that. E pluribus unum, out of many one. And that's an important element of our society. And the third is compromise. We have to be willing to compromise with people we sometimes disagree, and we do that because of our sense of community and because we consent to the laws under which we're governed. We're not governed by coercion. We're governed by, we are willing to accept the laws, we're governed by those laws as an element of our consent because of our sense of community. And that is fragile. And that's why it's so important that we try to maintain that and protect that. And that's one of the things that the rule of law does by imposing discipline on our society and by enforcing norms of behavior that are really critical to people living together, working together, prospering together.
Justice McGregor, Chief Justice John Roberts has said that once you become a judge, you're not a Republican judge, you're not a Democratic judge, you are an impartial and independent judge. What can and should judges themselves do to reinforce their independence, their impartiality, and continue respect for the courts, which is so important to us?
Yeah, continued respect for the courts is essential because that's why people follow the ruling of the court. I think we're at a really critical time in dealing with this because the selection of judges in both our state and federal systems has become so much more partisan political over the last couple of decades, I guess. Because we're here, I would remind people that when Justice O'Connor was confirmed in 1981, it was with no negative votes. And we're long past that. So if the process itself of selecting judges is becoming more political, then we shouldn't be too surprised when we get judges who understand that they are in their position as a result of a political process. But we still need the judges to be impartial and independent. So we have to rely then on the individuals who take the oath of office to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States and of the state in which they sit. Judges can do that, I think, only by constantly checking themselves, only by constantly looking to see that they don't have a reaction to a case that determines the final outcome. I know personally there were so many cases when I started out with a kind of a general notion of where I thought the case was going, and after doing what I believed was an objective analysis, I came to a different decision. But judges who know immediately what the outcome will be of a case almost certainly are relying on factors that are extraneous to the justice process. So the only way we can really control that is through the personal behavior of the judges. One of the other things that a lot of courts are doing that I think helps us with this is fairly recently we've learned the importance of implicit bias. And a lot of courts are doing training for their judicial officers so that we can determine what implicit bias we carry with ourselves, and then you can correct for that. But the only real check, judges are not likely to be moved, federal judges, by impeachment, as Senator Kyle said. Removing state court judges isn't very easy, although in partisan elections probably more so. So the only real check is on the judges themselves and the sanctity of the oath that we take and the understanding of how important an independent, impartial judiciary is to the rule of law. If we lose that, we lose the underpinnings of our American form of democracy, and we lose the trust of the people in our court system. So it's a very big burden on the shoulders of judges because it all comes down to individual judges maintaining that view of the rule of law.
One of the core principles in our system is equal protection before the law, all people being treated equally. This simple phrase, as our history teaches us, is easier said than done. Nicole Carroll, let me ask you, we may be doing this and working at this better than a lot of countries in the world, but how are we doing in terms of living up to this pretty ambitious ideal?
It's an absolutely worthy goal, but unfortunately we have a mixed record. Perhaps the lawyers, I'm the only non-lawyer up here, so you all know the law. I can tell you what we report over and over and over. And what we report is people who are low income, people of color, have challenges with the justice system. It's not everybody's experience, but it is absolutely fair to say that in many areas of the law, immigration law or wrongful convictions or the death penalty, there's a pattern there that suggests unequal treatment. The stories are heartbreaking.
Senator Kyle, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, he was president for 13 years and appointed 8 different justices to the Supreme Court, all Democrats. When he died and Harry Truman, also a Democrat, became president, Truman's first appointment to the Supreme Court was the appointment of a Republican as a bipartisan gesture. If something like that were to happen today, what do you think the impact of that would be in terms of the rule of law, in terms of respect for the court and the independence of judges?
If pigs could fly, right?
Your word, not mine.
In the state of Arizona, the first appointment to the Arizona Supreme Court by a Republican governor was of a very fine jurist who is sitting to my right, who was not a Republican. And that's the kind of thing which enhances respect, not just for the governor, but for the court. And were that to be the case, we have progressed or regressed to a point where I think it's not only unlikely that it would be a different political party, but that through the kind of research that we can now do on people's backgrounds, prior judicial decisions and the like, not just the decision makers in the Senate or the president, but also the public generally, and certainly in the media, people can get a pretty good idea of what they think a particular nominee will do or won't do on the bench. And woe to the president, I think, who would appoint someone that wouldn't meet the expectations of his base or her base of supporters. That's just where we have gotten today because at the Supreme Court level in particular, but also at some of the lower courts, the process has become so politicized. Now, why has that happened? One reason is because the decisions of the courts are at least considered to be so important that to litigants, it makes all the difference in the world whether you have a judge that's going to support you or a judge that doesn't support you. One way to get around the problem, therefore, is to reduce the importance of the decisions of the court to society in general, get back to the point that they generally affect the litigants a whole lot, but not a whole lot beyond that. But because Congress leaves too much authority to the executive, and because presidents like to seize too much authority, and because Congress is lazy in the way it drafts, and because of a whole lot of other problems, the courts are now asked to make a lot of really important decisions. And because those decisions are so important politically, the political players therefore treat them as almost existential matters politically, and that's why you get the kind of conflicts and contests that has characterized the confirmation process in recent years.
Nicole Carroll, on the subject of freedom of the press, press performs a number of different functions. It informs all of us. It also, from time to time, performs a bit of a watchdog service in terms of reporting or disclosing fraud or unlawful conduct within the government. And historically, there's been a tradition in the media, as you know better than we, of distinguishing between facts or news and opinion. As media has evolved in the last few decades, we have many more outlets than before, some of which disregard this distinction. Give us your sense of what kind of challenges that presents for an important paper like your own.
That's absolutely true. And the question that kind of has come up before is, are there any new rules needed for this new reality? And I don't think so. I don't think that would be in keeping with the First Amendment. Again, at the time of our founding, the newspapers were political. They were funded by political parties. There was no difference between news and opinion. I think we're in a much healthier place now. I think that we are much more trusted and objective, obviously, than in those times. That being said, I do think organizations can do a better job of differentiating between the two and the sense of clarity. But our role, you talked about that as well, absolutely is to spread truth without fear or favor. And our responsibility is to do that accurately and fairly. and that's what we abide by.
Miles, does this blending of fact and opinion create issues for integrity in government? Every administration wants to make its best case, present its side of the story as well as possible. But where do you draw the line between making your best case and being untruthful in terms of dealing with the media and people in government dealing with the media?
In the legal context, with respect to lawyers, that's a sort of an easier question to answer because the rules of ethical conduct limit what a lawyer can say to the media about a case in which the lawyer is actively involved while the case is ongoing. I think with government, it's an interesting challenge, and I know I spoke recently to the National Attorney General's Association of Attorneys General on this issue because they face an interesting challenge. They are elected officials and they have an obligation to speak to the public, to speak to their constituents on issues affecting their office, which by definition often always involves handling of cases. At the same time, they have legal requirements as lawyers not to try cases in the court of public opinion. And so it's a challenge. I think there are government ethics rules that certainly require and promote integrity in government and honesty in communication. I think that government officials always try to spin the news, as an argument can be made, as most people do who have an opportunity to speak to the press in their favor. But government officials have a unique responsibility. They are public officers, they are elected officials, and they should try and to the extent possible to speak honestly or not at all to the press. One of the challenges, though, is that you don't want them to close themselves off from the press. The press provides an avenue for the public into the operations of government. We all cannot be at a press conference. We all cannot file Freedom of Information Act requests. We need the media, we need the press, we need the news to be doing that, and they do it, in essence, on the public's behalf. So we want government to be accessible, we want it to be open, but we also want it to be honest. And those are all challenges that some officials meet better than others.
Nicole Carroll, I think there's always potential for tension between any administration in government and the press. Unknown to me until recently was that when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he was annoyed by Joseph Pulitzer, who was a titan of a journalist at the time, and sought to prosecute him for criminal defamation, which was not a crime. And ultimately, the Supreme Court blocked that. But my question for you is about protection of freedom of the press, and is that as robust as it should be in your mind? Are we doing okay in terms of living up to protecting freedom of the press?
That's a great question. I do think it's fair to say that, again, since the founding, journalists have been annoying people in government. I think that's been the case throughout. Because, again, our job is to report the truth, without fear or favor. And that takes, it takes resources, it takes access. So when you talk about protecting the freedom of the press, one thing that we have seen in recent years, and I so appreciate the ethics that you hold the government to and that they should be responsive to the constituents, but we have found just a real wall when it comes to public records and public access, that it seems to be as the press has less resources, Some folks in government are taking that opportunity to block our access, knowing that it's harder for us to challenge. We will continue to challenge, but you asked the question of, are we doing enough to protect freedom of the press? I think access to public records, public meetings, the inner workings of government is vital to our democracy, and I think we all should be supporting that and demanding that.
I'd like to turn back for a moment to the subject of political polarization, which we've had at various times in our history. Early on, also during Reconstruction, we've certainly seen a resurgence of it in the last 15 or 20 years. And Justice McGregor, I'd like to ask you, the kind of polarization that we see from time to time obviously hampers the ability of people who disagree to see the other side of an issue. I'm thinking of here in Arizona, there have been leaders, and I'm thinking of Justice O'Connor and John McCain, who've been able to steer a middle course and come up with compromise solutions. Is that something we need to recapture in terms of the ability to work together for compromise solutions?
Of course, we need it. And I'll be interested to hear Senator Kyle speak on this, because we all know from our personal and professional lives, we reach the best decisions when we get input from opposing views and are able to move to a position that takes the best of all of the ideas and comes up to a solution. That's ideally what our legislative body should be doing, and to some extent, I guess, the executive branch also. But I think the question is not whether we should have it, but whether that is attainable. It's hard to think of anybody on the national scene who is playing that role now. I think there are some members of Congress who would like to play the role but don't have sufficient power to bring people together. And as we get more and more polarized, it becomes less and less likely, I think, that this will happen. So what do we do as citizens? I think that this is where the power that resides in the people has to be exercised. We know whether our elected officials are willing to try to work to the best solution or whether they are always in a strictly partisan position. And just as citizens, we have the right to change those people. But it's a difficult, long road. And I actually fear for our ability to resolve the difficult issues that face our country. This isn't a justice system issue, but I think we all see how difficult it is to get Congress to act on matters that need attention. And I think it's because there is no one there drawing people together to find a solution. So is it a great objective? Do we need it? Yes. Is it attainable in the current atmosphere? I think the answer is probably not.
There's a recent book written by two historians entitled How Democracies Die. And one of the points that they make is that extreme partisan polarization not only undercuts the rule of law and civility, but it can actually kill democracies. And they cite several examples around the world of that. Senator Kyle, how do we know when we're at a point where this is too severe a problem that we need to do something about it because our institutions may be threatened?
Well, it's a good question as to when do we know it's too severe a problem. A little bit of context might help. Just about through reading a biography of Hamilton by Ron Chernow, and it becomes clear in remembering what the circumstances were at that time that you had a conflict between two different groups of people. They weren't political parties yet, but they were the forerunners of the two parties, who believed that the other side was truly up to, and I mean no good. I mean that they were up to evil. Jefferson thought Hamilton wanted to be a monarch and that he would ruin the country by trying to run it. And Hamilton thought Jefferson was just Robespierre and in colonial garb, that he believed in revolution to the point of anarchy. Well, if either of those had been true, fortunately they weren't, then the decisions that the country made about that would have been literally existential, one way or the other. And so they fought harder than any of the kind of political conflicts you see today, believe me. And as Nicole said, the media back then were bought and paid for by the two different sides. And that's what people saw. And they lined up on either side, and politics was pretty much a no-holds deal. But what saved it? In the end, and this is what's really important, the rule of law saved our country, the Constitution, and the goodwill of the people to understand it and to apply it. And to know that actually it was okay if the other side won and your side didn't, that you'd have another shot in 2 years or 4 years, and that the other side wasn't going to turn out the lights and on the Republic. But it took a while for that point to be established, that to the point that citizens did breathe a little easier when their side lost and the other side won. Because there was an established constitution and a tradition of enforcing it, and the courts enforcing the rule of law that helped to enforce it, to make sure that nobody was ever totally disadvantaged in our country. It wasn't like a dictatorship where if you lost, you were hung. And so you had to fight like heck. I think some people today believe that the other side is so evil that it does represent an existential threat, and that's why they are prone to extreme and radical points of view and even actions, even to the point of potentially challenging rule of law precepts that they think might get in their way. They need to have confidence in the rule of law writ large, starting with the U.S. Constitution and all of the legal precedents and political traditions that accompany that. And one of the political traditions is you may win tomorrow, you may lose tomorrow. The other side is always going to have something to say about it. See if you can work with them. Frequently, it works out. And if we can get back into that mode of thinking, and it does require really a little bit of a change in point of view on the citizenry, and it certainly requires better leadership than we've had, then I think our country will be just fine again. We've gone through similar times in the past. What I worry about is the fact that younger generations are not adequately schooled today in the civics of their country, the necessary elements of survival and their role in that as a good citizen. And that if they don't have that kind of education, then they're not going to have a basis for which to make really important decisions about who their representatives are and what is within the bounds of law and what is not.
And indeed, there's a generation growing up now for the last 20 years for which this has been the new normal, this degree of polarization. I do think it's fascinating how much history we've all learned from the musical Hamilton. It has taught us a great deal. Nicole Carroll, I want to ask you, polls consistently show, and I want to turn to Congress, which is our lawmaking body and obviously critical to the rule of law. Of all of our national institutions, the Congress currently by a wide margin has the lowest level of trust and confidence of our institutions, including the press and the presidency, and you go right through the whole list. And John, you mentioned how entrenched that is. How do we break out of that as a society? Because there are built-in retaliatory impulses in a polarized society. What's our path forward here?
Absolutely. I do want to just go back to Senator Kyle talking about the importance of civics education and point out that my son's middle school government teacher is in the audience, and I think that's really awesome. So thank you for being here. I just noticed her. I'm like, that is awesome. He loves government because of you. So thank you. So back to your question about... Yes, exactly. She's awesome. You talk about the popularity of Congress or the judiciary. In a poll, no one's ever going to, vote, I love Congress, or I love the courts, or I love the press. But when asked individually, they do love Senator Kyle, and they love Justice McGregor. They do. I mean, we form these bonds one-on-one. And honestly, when it comes to the popularity of the press, as much of a beating as we can take sometimes, when there's an issue to be solved, they come to us, they call us. Justice McGregor and I were just talking before this about the story the press did about the broken locks at the Lewis prison system. And that was someone who went to the press and said, this is an issue, a very serious issue that needs to be addressed. So certainly the popularity is an issue, but I'm heartened by the fact that the individual members of Congress or the judiciary or the press are respected and sought out. I think as a path forward, and Justice McGregor, you talked about this, the people have to lead the way. How can we expect our government to compromise and be civil and to consider other sides if we ourselves are not? And I think that is definitely another role of journalism, is to present diverse opinions. If we can read diverse opinions and if we can find something in the other side that we can agree with, that's the basis of compromise, and that's a really good start.
I want to ask you a question that relates to both the Congress and the judiciary. Republican Senator Ben Sasse has publicly stated that what is often thought of as judicial activism, that is to say, courts deciding issues of policy, is really a result of Congress failing to do its job. That is to say, if the Congress does not engage on these difficult issues, they then get litigated and fall into the laps of courts. Justice McGregor, does that ring true to you in terms of being a problem?
Well, I'm not sure that I think Senator Sasse said that courts are making public policy decisions because Congress won't act. I'm not sure that's exactly true. It happens occasionally. I think this wasn't congressional inaction, but occasionally the courts do make public policy decisions. I think of the example as being one that Justice O'Connor speaks about, and that was in Bush versus Gore, where the court made a decision because, as she later explained, something had to be done. We had to be able to move our process forward, although perhaps it did damage to the court to take on that case. But other cases that come to the court, as you all know, the court can't just decide a public policy issue. It has to come before the court in a case. And most of the cases that are referred to as, the court legislating or judicial activism involve the court giving greater meaning to what is sometimes vague language in a statute. Senator Kyle earlier mentioned that perhaps Congress could be more specific in their use of language. And I think that this is part of the problem of polarization. It's when people are not really ready to compromise, in order to get anything done, language tends to be watered down and get more and more vague. So then these cases come to the court. So an employer must make a reasonable accommodation of someone. Well, what is reasonable do these particular facts show a reasonable accommodation or do they not? Somebody can't impose an undue burden. Well, under these facts, is that an undue burden or not? So many of the cases where the court makes these decisions involve interpreting language that may not be as specific as we might wish. And in constitutional interpretation, the language is always general. We're all entitled to the due process of law. Well, exactly what process is due in a particular case? We're all entitled to equal protection of the law. But what does that mean, and what test do we apply to determine it? So the court is I guess in a sense, making policy decisions, but I think the more correct way to describe it is that the court is doing its best to interpret the language of the Constitution or the statute before it. The court isn't always right. The legislative body can change the statute if the court interprets it wrong. The people can change the Constitution if the court interprets it incorrectly. But these policy issues that come to the court are more interpretive matters, I think, than the court reaching out to make policy decisions, although certainly they have broad impact.
Senator, you recall, there were years when the U.S. Senate was regarded as the world's greatest deliberative body, a compliment it does not get frequently these days. My question is a where do we go from here question. Is it a question of repopulating the Senate with the new generation? Can leadership within that body bring about a change in the wake of the kind of polarization that we've seen?
Well, this is the big question that many seminars and town halls and so on like this address, and one might expect that there is no one answer to the question. I think a lot of it goes back to civic education, because at the end of the day, the citizenry will hold its public servants accountable as it deems fit. But if the citizenry isn't aware of the reasons why our government is set up the way it is, and the benefits that can derive from that if we protect it, then the citizenry isn't going to care. And to a large extent, I don't know whether it was Mark Twain that said it, your public servants serve you right, but I think it was him. And to a large extent, they do reflect what the citizenry is telling them. Don't touch our Social Security. Okay, but we're going to go bankrupt. I know, but don't touch our Social Security. So put yourself in the position of the representative who is supposed to carry out the will of the people. So it starts with the people themselves. And the people have to appreciate the reasons why their government is set up the way it is and how it operates. And they won't if they're not educated. And then you have to have good leaders, people who are willing to take on a tide of public opinion or their own political party or the powers that be, and are willing to say enough of this, we're going to have to do it differently. I think it takes a longer view of things, a view that appreciates the value of traditions and the fact that even though something seems so important right at the moment, if I don't get my way totally, it'll be all right somehow or other. Now, you don't see a whole lot of that in a freshman congressman these days. Freshman congressmen are sent back there to, by God, do what do whatever. And by the way, the good politicians are able to convince their constituency that they're doing just fine. It's the other guys that are all wrong. So you can't just blame the citizenry. I mean, people can be fooled into supporting their incumbent because the incumbent is always going to have more information than the citizens. I've gone to a lot of town hall meetings, and I've never felt uncomfortable because I knew when I went that I generally would probably know more about the subject than anybody else who was there. So I had an unfair advantage. And so you've got to have an educated citizenry, yes, but you also have to have honest leaders that are willing to educate and teachers that are willing to educate, and a sense that in the end, the rule of law in this country will make it okay. If you lose, it won't be the end of the world. And that's why I keep getting back to the rule of law. It is so important. But our citizenry is not going to understand it if it's not taught.
Will and Ariel Durant, the famous historians who comprehensive history of civilization, have made the point that democracy is the most demanding form of government because it requires an educated, informed, and engaged citizenry. And with a shout out to our civics teacher here, we know that high schools and other schools have been dropping civics education and government education at a time when, Nicole, our ultimate check and balance is in fact the public. And so in light of that, are we up to that task of performing what John Kyle just outlined and what we need to be able to do?
We have to be. Education is the most important thing, 100% agree. I love iCivics, the O'Connor Institute. I love that, with the idea being, how do you know if the rule of law is being challenged if you don't know the rule of law? Like, how do you know? So teaching civics and iCivics is so important. And this is also, we're going to put another plug in for journalism. That's what we do. That's what we do. I feel incredibly responsible. You can ask anybody. At USA Today, we have one of the largest audiences of any media in the country. And every day when I'm in that news meeting and there's a topic that comes up, I say, do people know what that means? Do we need to give a definition? Do we need to explain? How do we make sure we get different opinions on that so that we can do that education? It's the schools, it's journalism, it's honest government officials giving the truth, and then ultimately it's up to the people to accept that, receive that, and learn from that.
So hats off to Justice O'Connor and her iCivics project, and to Camp O'Connor and what is being done there, because the buck does stop with us. Before we open it up to questions, I'd like to ask each of you if there were one thing that you might cite that we individually or collectively might do over the next few years to strengthen our democracy and strengthen the rule of law, what would come to your mind as something to highlight? And Miles, let me start with you.
That's an interesting question. If there were one thing, just following up on the discussion about civic education, it would be for each of us to support efforts in our schools, particularly in our secondary schools, to engage students on issues of civic awareness and civic education, support those programs. I think that would be huge. Also, how much do we know? I mean, obviously this is a panel of people who know a great deal. That's not true generally. And what can we each do to promote in our circle of friends, in our acquaintances, among our colleagues at work, among our family, greater engagement and with and knowledge about the process of government, what the rule of law means, start with conversations and end up with maybe trips to see a Supreme Court argument, trips to see a legislative session at the State House, a trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with your congressman or senator, who generally are very happy to meet with constituents. That kind of sort of grassroots endeavor and activity, I think, would be a great place to start to expand the scope of knowledge, and with knowledge hopefully would come a greater understanding and a greater willingness to at least listen to what the other side has to say.
Nicole.
Yes, +1 on all of that. Also, I think the most important thing we can do is lead the way. Lead the way in talking about compromise. It's Constitution Day. Let's remember that the Bill of Rights was one giant compromise, right, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and it's what got the Constitution ratified by the states. Look what a magnificent Constitution we have as a result of that. So again, it's teaching that history and teaching that tradition. I think it's leading the way in civility. We can disagree. We can go hard at the government. We can disagree over records, but we don't delegitimize the person or the institution. And we ask for the same respect back from them. And let's spread truth. Let's keep each other honest. Honesty is under attack, and it's up to all of us to push back.
But we're going to be unanimous here, at least so far, unless we get a dissent from Justice McGregor. And knowing her, I don't think we will, but I think it starts with civic education, and it has to be the right civic education. I think you start with the Declaration of Independence, move on to the preamble of the Constitution, and study a lot of history in the course of it. If you do that, you'll appreciate this country's commitment to liberty and to equality and to a system of law based upon the rule of law that, if properly executed by the citizenry and their representatives, can guarantee the very best that a country can possibly do in ensuring that those goals are satisfied. Without that education to begin with, freedom can be lost, equality will not occur, because the citizenry will fail to appreciate the mechanisms by which you can achieve those things. So it goes back, I think, to the beginning and to civic education.
And I do agree with everything that has been suggested, but I think we need to take it one step further. We take all of our educated citizens and we challenge each of them to take their part in our democracy. Our percentage of people who vote in our elections is astoundingly low. You know, maybe we'll get up to 65 or 70% in a presidential election, but that means 3 out of 10 people who could vote are staying at home and not taking part in the democracy. So everybody has to take responsibility for their own civic involvement, not only in voting, but in supporting civic or institutions and in supporting our schools so they can educate. But every citizen needs to stand up and take their role so that we can really say that we have a representative democracy.
This, as you know, is what we've advertised as a rule of law town hall. So we want to have a bit of a town hall discussion and open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. We love questions that end in a question mark, and we love comments that end. And we have some folks will get microphones around to anyone with a question, and I see a first hand right here in the front row. Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you. My name's Martin Lynch, and my question is about the powers of the government are limited, and also the separation of powers, which I believe are part of that concept. And my question is your thoughts on the judicial branch of government and their role in the political process of creating law. Is there a separation there where the where judges are, their role is to decide cases based upon the law and apply the law, as opposed to how much of their role should be the political process of creating law and promoting law or opposing law they don't like during the legislative process that goes on?
Well, the role of the judges clearly, for the most part, is not to make law. In this country, we have an exception to that because we still maintain our common law tradition, which came with England to this country. And the few areas of law that are still left to the common law are judge-made law. Most of that deals with contracts and personal injury and so forth. Property rights also. In most states, there are now statutes adopted by the legislature that have taken over that area. But we do still have some areas of judge-made law, properly judge-made law. For the most part, you're right. It is not the duty of our judges to make law. It's the duty to interpret the laws, the Constitution, and to apply that law to the facts of the case. I really, in preparation for this, we had talked a bit about judges legislating from the bench. And so I actually went to some articles that were critical of judges for legislating from the bench. And in almost all those cases, the dispute was over whether the person writing agreed or disagreed with the interpretation the judges gave to the law. And there's always room for debate there. Especially at the United States Supreme Court level, the cases wouldn't be there if they weren't very difficult. So there are good arguments to be made on one side or another. And we see cases that are disputed, ranging from politically liberal to politically conservative. So I think we just judges should not be making the law, but judges are required to interpret the law and to apply it to the specific facts of a case. And I think you would be hard-pressed to find a judge who didn't agree that that was their proper role.
And I might add the comment that, and Justice McGregor can second-guess me on this, but cases come before courts in which there's a dispute between two parties. They each have a view, and there is no law, no statute, and no constitutional provision, those tend to be quite general, that answers that question. And so to decide the dispute, a court must make a decision that is not explicitly and clearly called on or anticipated by either a statute or a constitutional provision. And I think whoever loses or wins that case could call that judge making law, because you can't point to a specific statute that answers that specific question.
Yeah, that happens so frequently. Just as an example, the Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. And that was put in there because the colonists were very frustrated by the fact that the military branch of the king would just enter their houses without any reason for doing so. So an unreasonable search or seizure is forbidden. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that particularly today, can law enforcement agencies use drones to see what's going on? We can't look to the intent of the founders because they didn't have drones. We have all kinds of ways that law enforcement can, in essence, enter your home that don't require a physical intrusion today. So is that an unreasonable or a reasonable search and seizure? What the Supreme Court has held is in that generally, to have a reasonable search or seizure, you need a warrant, which means that a judicial officer has passed on it. But the Constitution doesn't say that, it just says unreasonable. So we have a whole series of cases under the Fourth Amendment interpreting what is a reasonable search or seizure. Now, when the courts do that, they're not writing law, they're interpreting a constitutional provision that, as Homer says, doesn't have a lot of specific instruction in it. So, yeah, I would agree.
Other questions and comments? See one up top? Oh, you're going to be busy.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Up the stairs first.
Who was
Hand up there.
Okay, Stephen Richer, also an attorney. I was wondering, so we talked a lot about social ills of society and some of the problems, and all of you have seen behind the curtain, so to speak, in both society and law. And I was curious, do you really go to bed worried about the country and its future? Because to me, it seems that life's pretty good for the most part. And I wonder how much of this is just E.J. Montini or Ben Shapiro needing to literally shout every day that the sky is falling, because otherwise no one will listen to you.
I think that's a good point, and it's one of the things that I was alluding to earlier. At the very beginning of our country, there really were existential threats to the country as they knew it at that time. But there were also some false premises. Jefferson thought Hamilton was going to turn this into a monarchy. Hamilton thought Jefferson was going to have anarchy forever. And they approached their political careers based on the proposition that they had to win, because if the other side won, it was over. And naturally, they resorted to some pretty severe kinds of political criticism of their opponents and the like. I think that with over 200 years of tradition and practice and history behind us, if we understand the foundation of the country, and if we all appreciate the value of those foundational principles, we can probably take a deep breath and acknowledge that the world won't end if the Democrats win the next election or if the Republicans win the next election, as long as we continue to adhere to the rule of law, which means, okay, so the Democrats win next time, they can only go so far. And after all, they can only be in office for so many years. And then it's the other guy's turn if they happen to win. And if we have enough confidence in our Constitution and in the civics education of the people and in the traditions that have gone on for over 200 years, we shouldn't really worry about those who are shouting the loudest about the end is near, and we'd have more confidence in the future of our country. But I think some of us at least have a little niggling of a doubt in the back of our mind is, do the people have enough appreciation for all of this to continue to make the kind of decisions that have gotten us through the crises in the past? That's where my little bit of concern is. In the past, we had a pretty well-educated citizenry, and we agreed on the rule of law principles, and we agreed to abide by them, and things worked out okay 4 years from now, if not right now. But if you don't continue to nurture that understanding, then there could come a time when the great tradition is not there to back you up and help you make the right decisions.
If I could just respond to the other part of that about E.J. Montini, the end is near. It's great that things are going well for you. That's wonderful. But part of journalism's job is to give voice to the voiceless. And things aren't going great for a lot of people out there. And that is part of our job to bring that to light. And that is what he's doing. And I have great respect for him for doing that.
Connor, why don't you head over here while Miles makes his comment? I saw some hands down over here.
I just wanted to follow up. I think Nicole was exactly right. And I think there are stresses on our society today that are, if not unique, at least unusual in our recent history. How we perceive immigrants coming into the country, how we handle economic inequality. Right now we have low unemployment, which is good, but there's still devastated communities that are grappling with underemployment and unemployment. How we change our energy response from coal and oil to other forms of energy. I mean, we are grappling with some I don't know that I'd call them existential issues today, certainly not as they were back at the founding, but very difficult, important issues, and we're not alone. Look at what's happening in Britain. Look at what's happening in other countries around the world. This is a very interesting time in which we live, and I think it's really important for people to be engaged and to be involved and to try to understand what's happening and again to see that our divisions aren't widened. I must say it's striking often how little common assumptions people make about different events that happen, or about different beliefs, or about different behavior. What is entitled to equal protection? Or what should I not have to tolerate because I don't like it? We're asking questions that are very difficult, and we as a society, through our interest in our community, through our consent to our laws, and through our willingness to compromise, can get through this. But if we lose those principles, I do think some of these crises could become existential.
I think I saw some hands over here. Let's go to the second row there, Connor.
Roy Miller, my question is, when asked about what kind of government we were given, Benjamin Franklin famously said it was a republic if you can keep it. My question is, are we keeping it? And maybe as one example, I would imagine he would be chagrined by the Western states having adopted things like initiative, referendum, and recall, which kind of move us away from a republic toward a democracy. I'm wondering if you think we're keeping the republic.
Well, you do see, at least among some young people today, a movement toward more democracy and less representative government. A suggestion, for example, the Electoral College should be abolished and the president elected by popular vote. And there are some other kinds of examples like that. But so far, we have retained the basic structure of the Constitution as written, and I believe the courts have, by and large, interpreted it in that fashion. Abraham Lincoln asked the same question. I mean, this was something that troubled him all along, and he was only one generation after the founding. You find that in the Gettysburg Address even. You know, can a country so created endure? And I think that the answer has already been supplied here, namely, if we continue to understand why our system was set up the way it was, and appreciate that there was a great deal of wisdom in that could help us govern throughout the ages. And if we continue to maintain the sense of community that I think Miles has talked about a lot here tonight, community which is not just because we're with people we like or that look like us, but who share the same basic values that we do, then I think we do retain it, because it's clearly shown to be the most successful kind of government and economic system to go along with it. But there are a lot of wise people who have said you've got to rekindle that knowledge and that love and that sense of community every generation, or it will pass on. You know, freedom isn't free, and you've got to educate yourself to maintain it. It's like, you know, I see all these young people that are doing so much to keep their bodies in shape so that they won't get sick and they'll live a long life. Our government, our country needs the same kind of care. So as long as we adhere to the goal that each one of us articulated here, I'll figure that I'm on the optimistic side of things.
I think this lady here has a question.
Hi. I've been a court watcher for 26 years. I get every gray hair. I've earned every one of them. So I'm in the courts about 3 days a week. In the family law, the dependency courts, yeah. In the family law, the dependency courts, and the probate courts. And now a lot of the issues in those courts are morphing into the criminal courts. And Federalist 83 talks about checks and balances, and that would be a jury of your peers. That would be a great check and balance in some of these courts when things don't work out. And also, about a year ago in October, I went to my first Judicial Council meeting in Flagstaff, and I saw that the judges were writing laws. And I was shocked by that. And I've been continuing to go to those Judicial Council meetings. And then I found out that our Supreme Court has lobbyists that are highly paid, and they go to our legislature, and they take these laws, and they are passed immediately. So I'd like to know what you all think about that. We're shocked by that, and we're fighting it.
Well, I'm a little at a loss to know what you're talking about. I attended many Judicial Council meetings, and I don't recall any instance when we wrote laws. The court does review, the Supreme Court has responsibility for administering the court system statewide, and the court does review legislation that impacts the administration of justice. And the court does have a lobbyist, a government, whatever we call them now, who goes over and talks with the legislature only on bills that impact the administration of justice. This is an entirely appropriate thing for the court to do, because the legislature often has laws that will impact the way that the court system is run, or the way that the probation system, which is under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in Arizona, is administered. So the court should be involved in laws that impact the administration of justice, and I think the legislators would be most surprised and probably quite chagrined if they didn't get input from the court on those laws. But I'm not sure what you're referring to in the rest. I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards. But the court is, I mean, I can't think of a single, the court is involved, well, again, the court is only involved in legislation that impacts the court system and the administration of justice or one of the positions that the court oversees, such as probation. And I don't think we would want it to be any other way because we want the input from the court. Interesting, your reference to juvenile and probate proceedings and so forth. Those have been traditionally areas in which neither the common law nor any part of our government has ever used a right to a trial by jury. It could be expanded to those, but it would be very different from our judicial traditions in dealing with those types of law. It's not one of the areas that is guaranteed by our Constitution.
Let's take a couple more questions, one up top and then one over here. Sorry, we're making you run.
It's okay. I run cross country.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just sorry.
Oh my gosh. Okay, didn't know we were playing.
They said you could throw that microphone. And,
It's
you
soft,
just
I didn't
proved it.
know. Good evening, thank you. This has been most enlightening. I'm Linda Arders, and I'm an elder justice advocate, and I'd like to ask the question here. The Constitution was written in Philadelphia. I'm a Philadelphia native, but obviously the lifespan at that time was not what it's projected to be now, which is fortunately in the 80s. Since statistically by 2035, we're going to have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18, which means our whole country's structure and operating systems and everything really is going to be a lot different than what it's been. My question to you, from looking at this from the rule of law and what we've been experiencing in probate court, in guardianship court, and in dealing with issues having to do with cognitive decline, which happens to all of us. By the way, it starts when you're about 40 and you start forgetting things. So it's just natural, even though you work out all the time. It's become an issue in the courtroom, as we've seen, where the judicial branch and the legal branch, I guess that's together, seem to be making the decisions without the medical input. And it's becoming controversial. I was fortunate enough to have a discussion in Washington during Elder Abuse Awareness Week with Senator Barrasso, who's an orthopedic surgeon. And let me just summarize how I put it to him. Senator, how would you like to have an attorney come into your operating suite to assist you? And he gave me a look like you can only believe. And I said, well, that's what we seem to be experiencing in the courtrooms, because we're having the legal profession making decisions or practicing medicine without a license. So my question to you would be, what is the legal system, what is the judicial system doing now to become more educated and knowledgeable about the aging of our population, the massive transfer of wealth, which is precipitating a tsunami of elder exploitation, and all the challenges that are being faced in courtrooms across the country?
That's an excellent question. And for example, here at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, we have a health policy group that's looking at the intersection between law and health. And of course, law and healthcare, that intersection goes back many generations, many years, and it addresses a variety of issues. Let me just take one that I worked on recently, and that's the opioid crisis. Is drug use and drug addiction, in some circumstances, that's criminal conduct if you're selling and purchasing, but on the other hand, how do you get medical treatment to help address those issues? So The Bar Association, the American Bar, state bars, lawyers in those organizations are reaching out to the American Medical Association and other associations to try to learn more about the medical issues older Americans have to deal with, because those medical and healthcare issues have legal implications. Someone who has property and is suffering from dementia, at what point will they no longer be competent legally to dispose of that property, to avoid the kind of abuse that's taking place? Lawyers need to be aware of that. They need to be in touch with both the medical and the social work professionals to address that. So you've identified an issue that the bar is aware of, that law schools are aware of, and are trying to work with the healthcare professionals and the medical community to address.
Let's take one final question over here.
Since the end of World War II and following the Marshall Plan, the United States has become a beacon of hope and a great example for much of the rest of the world, not necessarily all of it, but through that process we've also become the world's policeman. So how are we doing today as ambassadors for the rule of law internationally? Our hands aren't completely clean. We do make some mistakes. Homer, I know you work internationally a lot, and perhaps you could answer this and not leave it all to the panelists, but what could we be doing to kind of improve our role as ambassadors for the rule of law internationally?
I recently read an article that pointed out the obvious examples where the rule of law has declined, and some of these countries have been mentioned in Hungary and Poland and the Philippines and others, and some of those countries have constitutions that have borrowed heavily from ours. But it goes on to point out that there's a less highly publicized but roughly equal number of countries that have moved in the opposite direction. What I will say is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when so many countries were revising their legal systems, the United States was the gold standard. At that point, those countries, and Justice O'Connor and I worked together on this project, they were eager to know how this was done in the United States. They would not necessarily want to replicate exactly what we had done, but the United States was viewed with great admiration and really viewed as the rule of law gold standard. And I have to say that's not the prevalent attitude today. So part of the answer, I think, to your question is we have to live up to our own ideals and the kinds of principles that we've talked about this evening to set that example, because we were an example.
May I add one other thing? I was going to say two things, one of which is exactly that. You know, it's like kids watching their parents. They don't miss a thing. And other people in other countries, they watch us very carefully. And when we do well, they notice and they want to emulate. And when we don't, I think they're as unhappy about it as we are. But there's a second aspect of this. You mentioned we can't be the policeman of the world. We can, however, provide a value that we hold out, not just for ourselves, but for everybody in the world. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights and so on. And most of us believe that. And when we say that we stand with people in another country that are rebelling against a totalitarian and bad government, we should ask ourselves the question, what is our obligation to them? What else should we be doing besides saying we stand by you? Because that, you know, that 2 cents will get you not much these days. So we need to decide as a country how much we're willing to put our country's not just prestige, but also power behind those ideas. I happen, and there are big disagreements within my political party and among policymakers generally. We should stay out of people's others' affairs, let it be, we can't be the policeman of the world. I have a different point of view. I don't want to intercede in every conflict around the world, but I want to try to find ways to support people who are seeking freedom and who are seeking to try to create a society in which they will have the same kind of opportunities that we have. It's hard. It's not always easy. It's usually costly. And sometimes you do get into military conflicts over those kinds of issues. And that's the last thing you ever want to do. But I do think that as a country, we should think not only about how the values have helped us, but how they could help all people, and whether or not we have some obligation to engage in some activities that help to promote that around the world. You were involved, I gather, in helping some of these other countries create constitutions or legal systems which maybe emulated the United States system, which we think has worked pretty well. And if we could find all kinds of different activities like that that would help to take the ideas that we think have worked here and are good and are universal, without trying to ram them down anybody's throat, but at least to make them available, I would be all for doing that. And our government from time to time has been pretty active in trying to at least pursue that end. But it'll be something that the American people have to support.
With your indulgence, I'd like to conclude with a quotation that is a favorite of mine from a book entitled The Rule of Law by Lord Thomas Bingham. It's just a superb book. But the quote is by way of complimenting the panel on the wonderful discussion that we've had this evening, because in his introduction to his book, he says this book is addressed to those who have heard references to the rule of law, who are inclined to think that it sounds like a good thing rather than a bad thing, who wonder if it may not be rather important, but who are not quite sure what it is all about and would like to make up their minds. Thanks to this wonderful all-star panel this evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Before you all wander off, let me get a team photo.
All right.